The next segment is about in search of space for the arts. So what does it mean to hold space and to make space? What are the conditions needed to nurture artists, to develop, to create, to advocate? Yeah.
其实在新加坡我觉得一个艺术领域这一块拥有自己的空间，是一件很幸运，甚至我觉得可以是一件很奢侈的事情。那当你拥有了这个空间之后呢，你要怎么营造这个空间，让它变成让艺术工作者有机会去探险啊、去实验跟创作的一个平台？还有怎样可以连接社区社区上的人们？我觉得这是拥有空间的幸运的艺术工作者们可以去考虑的。所以我们今天呢，其实就请了 Waterloo Street 都在 Waterloo Street 一带，对不对？
一带靠近 Stafford Center
对的，4个艺术组织算吗？拥有空间的
拥有空间的，对，
艺术组织吧 ，OK， 包括什么
？Theatre Practice, Center 42, Objectives and Prisma。
对啦，然后让他们来谈谈到底他们怎样在这一条路上或者这一带，他们做了什么？怎么样给艺术工作者机会？怎么样跟社区产生一种关系
？So basically, talking about the placemaking activities that these beautiful venues do. Because space is such a precious resource for us artists. We will now move it over to the moderator, Dr. Ho Soo-fen.
Hey!
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome and thank you to everyone who is joining us live here today. My name is Shu-fen and I'm an arts researcher and educator from currently based at SMU and where I also lead the Arts and Culture Management program. So first and foremost, congratulations to Theatre Practice for 55 years of existence and for making it more than halfway through actually more than 3/4 through your 55 hours of live streaming. Secondly, I would like to extend a huge thank you to Jian Hong for inviting me to be part of this panel and for gathering all of us here together. And of course, to everyone at TTP who is working hard and tirelessly behind the scenes for making this happen. So this conversation today is entitled In Search of Space for the Arts, and where we will largely, our discussion today will largely revolve around the question of what does it actually mean to make and hold space for the arts, metaphorically and also literally in Singapore today. Where over the next 2 hours, we will have a conversation around questions and issues related to the notion of space. Because I think when we think about the arts today, whether it's the past, the present, but also the future of the arts and also future sustainability of the arts, we cannot avoid the topic of space, whether it's actual physical space or metaphorical space in terms of holding space for artists, but also arts workers. So today we will explore questions or even issues around, topics such as what are some of the conditions required to nurture and enable arts creation and development, what it means to support risk-taking and experimentation, to the challenges of running actual physical arts infrastructures today, and hopefully also discussing how to strengthen connections, how to work better together, and also how to enable mutual support and solidarity. And the conversation does not just end between us. And I would like to invite everyone who is tuning in to us online, whoever you may be, to also feel free to share your thoughts and questions in the chat box. And we will try our best to address them, or rather they will try their best to address them. So joining me here today are 4 amazing women who will be sharing their insights and experiences with us. So of course, we have Jian Hong from the Theatre Practice. We have Chelsea from Objectives. We have Shima from Prisma. And of course, we have Yan Ling from Center 42. So apart from our gender, I think what binds us all today, as mentioned by our host earlier, is that all of their organizations are currently based along the same street, which is Waterloo Street. So they are practices' neighbors. And I guess I'm also somewhat further down the street or across the road, I guess. But I think what is more crucial is to emphasize also the diversity in this panel today, where they all hold experiences in terms of running different types of art spaces, but also they focus on holding and making space for different types of artists at different stages in their career and development, and also from different disciplines, from theatre to film, photography, and of course contemporary Malay dance. But of course today the arts ecosystem cannot be strictly defined or confined by disciplines, and in fact many of their own projects and programs are also multidisciplinary, if not collaborative by nature as well. So let us now turn the spotlight on them, where let us start with some basic introductions. So perhaps we could go down the line where you could briefly provide us a kind of brief introduction of yourself, where you can share with us who you are, but also some of the good work that you've been doing with your organization. So let's start with Yanning.
Hi, my name is Yan Ling. So firstly, thank you TTP for inviting myself to this panel. So I'm from Center 42. We are literally just 2 doors away from TTP, the other Blue House. We've been here since 2014, since we first started. So Center 42 is briefly a theatre development space where we focus on supporting the creation of new work, the documentation of theatre history, and also, of course, the promotion of local theatre. So I'm the company manager for Center 42. Okay, over to you, Shima.
Hello, I'm Hashima Hares. I'm currently the company manager of Prisma. Prisma is essentially a dance company that actually creates in the intersection of tradition and contemporary. Largely, we focus on a lot of how to use our body and how dance could actually be a strategy to question and keep on questioning. Yeah, so then where is Malay, right? So Malay is, I guess, essentially a concept that we play with, and largely I think we also question on the structural sort of racial groups that we have within the society. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, so my name is Chelsea. I'm the program director at Objectives. So Objectives has been on Waterloo Street or Waterloo/Middle Road since 2015. So our center is in the little yellow chapel that you'll see at the corner of Middle Road and Waterloo. And it's been an amazing experience over the past 5 years just being in the location. So Objectives is a visual arts center that's focused on photography and film. Our mission is to inspire and broaden perspectives through the power of the image. And we have a special focus on supporting visual storytellers that come from or tell stories about underrepresented communities and focus on critical issues.
Hi, I'm Jian Hong, and it's strange to be sitting on this side of the room, and it's great, right, to see Sufan drive and I just go for the ride. I think for us, for practice, I'm the artistic director of the theatre practice, and for us, because we started as a performing arts school, right, and the other part of us is the theatre production. So those are the two most obvious existence of what we have been doing for the last 55 years. But of course, there are many other things. Sometimes it's very difficult to define who we are. Are we a training space? Are we a production space? Are we an intermediary? Are we an incubator? Are we, what are we? I think we just do whatever it takes to have this dialogue between art makers and the world that we reside within. And, it's really about what we need as a country, as a society, as a community, and what part can I play. So I think Practice's existence has been really about, on one hand, empowering us with tools and space, however you define it, to say those things or to express or to question or to explore, at the same time to connect with, on the ground. So, we're not limited by forms or languages or space even. Yeah.
So thank you everyone, and thank you to Jian Hong for starting to question what it means to actually hold space and how do we even define space today in the arts. I also think that what's nice about this panel and how they shared it as well is also the diversity of experiences where, of course, we have Practice who has your roots in 1965, but we also have Objectives that was established in 2003, even though they only moved to Waterloo Street more recently, and then we have Prisma and Center 42 who were established more recently as well. But I think to provide the audience and this panel a bit more context, I thought we could start with Jian Hong, who has, I guess, the most and richest experience amongst us. us and to help us provide some background context for our discussion. So since we are celebrating TTP's 55th anniversary, I thought it might be nice to revisit a quote from the late Mr. Kuo Pao Kun, who once said back in 1993, and this was in the context of him describing the state of the arts in Singapore back then, which is obviously a very different time. So he said, you need to have a space where you can allow your imagination or your ideas to just explode, to try out things. So I thought I'll ask Jian Hong, what are your thoughts about this quote? But it would be great if you could also contextualize your thoughts by reflecting on how the arts ecosystem has changed or has not changed since the 1990s to today, and why was it important to include a panel about space for your 55 hours live stream?
I mean, obviously, the most obvious, simple answer to give first is that we are on the same street, right? And that we have been talking a lot about space because of what's been happening to Center 42, which is our neighbor, as well as recently with TNS and with the substation, right? I think that, I mean, I grew up in the space, which was where art making and education was happening, which was the bungalow that we visited in the first segment of this 55 hour. And those spaces were quite hard to come by. They paid rent and market rate. And for arts company, that's the hardest thing, because for performing arts anyway, a lot of your making and constructions have to be in physical spaces. And whether we like it or not, space or land use is always the last thing we can control in our lives, right? In Singapore, that's just a reality. There's nothing that land doesn't own by anybody. If you buy freehold, doesn't mean that it's you own it. It can go away anytime. And so when we went into Waterloo Street at Stanford Arts Centre before we moved here 3.5 years ago, that was the beginning of art housing, right? And I think so all this time we've had a very sort of a fragile, love-hate relationship with space. When you are able to shut out reality outside and just focus in your little, experimental, creation space, it's wonderful to have that sanctuary to create. But then that thing is knocking out, like the boogeyman is constantly knocking on the door. Do you wonder when we're going to lose that? But that's also not just a physical thing, because on the street, we do talk a lot also about what does those space means in terms of a creative space, which is also something we struggle with, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, as artists in this country, right? So we have been always battling to keep the physical space as well as the creative space, but then also more importantly is the relationship between those two things, right? I can have this part and I can have that part, but how do you mix them together and what does it mean for each one of them? I think that's always something that we grapple with, and it's something that actually we have been dialoguing amongst us, quite a bit more recently. I suppose crises unite, right? And also I think the fact that with what happens in the last 9 months, space has also taken on a very different meaning. So it just exploded itself, the concept exploded, exponentially. So I think in the 90s until now, I don't think when he thought about that, he knew anything about virtual space, right? And he didn't really know, that the challenge, almost 27 years later, we are still facing the same challenge. In some ways, it hasn't changed.
So thank you, Jian Hong. And I think hearing you talk about how this issue of space and how we battle, or space has always been a site of contestation, whether it's from the 1990s or even earlier on till today, it's always been on the top of our minds, whether we are arts practitioner, arts manager, or even, I guess, a researcher like myself. And I think this reminds me of a quote that Sasi once said at the substation, where he once said that actually this idea of land scarcity or the lack of land use is actually just a kind of narrative. And that because when we believe it, then we always will think that we actually might not have enough space for the arts. But actually, is that really true? Can we actually just keep saying that because of the lack of land and because we are a small island in Singapore, does it mean then the arts shouldn't have space, physical space, but also literal space as well? So I thought I'll turn it over to you guys. What do you think? Do you resonate with any of the points that Jian Hong brought up? But in particular, also, what does it actually mean for you guys in terms of running actual art spaces? What does it actually mean to have space and hold space to support artists and the larger arts ecosystem in Singapore today? Anyone? Thank you, Chelsea.
Okay, so I'll go first. Well, I think that Objectives occupies quite an interesting position in this because, as you mentioned, Sufen, we were started in 2003, and we have gone through sort of different evolutions since. And the evolution in the Objectives also is reflective of the spaces that we've been able to occupy. And so when we started out in 2003, for instance, it was in a very small shop house in Liangxia Street. We were able to run certainly workshops out of the space, hold very small exhibitions, but the potentiality of those programs really saw and sort of exponential increase at exponential rate when we were able to occupy larger spaces, when we went to when we moved to Arab Street, and then now of course at Middle Road, where we now have a proper dedicated gallery space, classroom, a retail shop to showcase sort of DVDs and books by Southeast Asian photographers and filmmakers, and the kind of presence and that the organization is able to have within the arts community and also in the public's eye is really transformed with this sort of change in physical location. And so something you said, Jian Hong, really resonated with me in terms of, what's the correlation between creative space and physical space. And I think that certainly that there is a relationship there, right? And it's a really strong relationship, and that's coming through really strongly now at the moment with the residency program that we're doing at Objectives that has 4 women artists. And I mean, it's not a very long residency, it's only a month long, but the sort of feedback that we've been getting from the artists has been so positive in terms of, oh, it's so lovely to have a space in which to work out with, it's so lovely to have this physical space where we can experiment and try out different ideas and collaborate. And I think that over this sort of COVID period, we've been sort of fed this narrative, and to a certain extent it does hold true in that having this sort of virtual space expands the ways in which we can collaborate, and expands these sorts of pushes our imaginations in a different way. I mean, which is certainly true, but I think that from our experience, certainly with running this residency program, physical space is still such a key factor in sort of bringing those sort of creative energies together.
Thank you, Chelsea. And I think it's great that you mentioned a very tangible program as well, which is your residencies. Because I think here, when we think about space, sometimes we like to overgeneralize it, or we talk about it quite broadly. But actually, there are both tangible but also intangible forms of spaces and forms of support as well. And there are also varying levels of support for varying arts practitioners at different points of their artistic development and practice as well. So here, I thought I could get the rest of you to also share some of your actual programs in terms of how they actually support the arts ecosystem. But maybe let's go back to Chelsea again, because you started out the residency program. So why was it important for Objectives to have a residency program, in particular to support, I guess, artist creation and development? And here I will also share that I think once when a student of mine was doing a paper as well, and then he found that actually your residency program has actually impacted numerous artists as well, not just in terms of their artistic development, but also creating that kind of relationship back with Objectives in terms of future exhibitions, but also with other spaces in the area as well. So yes, Chelsea.
I think that I think that it goes back to what I was saying before, in that that sort of relationship between creative space and physical space is so important. And what we've realized at Objectives is that artists really value that kind of time and space to be able to devote to their practice. And it's not necessarily a kind of very physical kind of manifestation of the artistic process, like painting, for instance, or performance making, which of course entails a totally different sets of logistics. But because of the I think that people tend to assume that filmmakers, photographers, artists who work in sort of land-based mediums don't need a lot of space, because
maybe they can work from their bedrooms.
Yes. And many of them do. Many of them do. Which is really interesting because I had this conversation with an artist who is currently undertaking a residency somewhere else, and he works in the photographic medium, and he was really appreciative of the residency because he says that all these years I've been working in my bedroom, and what I've been able to sort of envision from my work, right, has been limited to the computer screen. And now having a space where I can actually print, where I can look at my work in a different way, where I can sort of consider spatially what the work does in different configurations, has been such a valuable process for this person. And I think it goes back to, you know, why this residency is important. At the end of the day, physical space does count for something. And it's not just the art making part. I think that the other part that is really integral to the success of the residency is the kind of relationships that we've been able to build with our artists, to have other artists who visit our space, interact with the resident, to be able to invite people to speak to the resident, to have the resident also participate in our programs. And you know, this is that kind of relationship building that is really intangible but so important. And this is why we've gone on to have such strong relationships with our residents, because you get to know their practice really well. You get to know how they work. You get to know, like, okay, like, can this person possibly, like, maybe teach in our workshops, or maybe participate in a future exhibition. And these sort of potentialities it's not always evident in the kind of discussion, one or two discussions that you have with an artist. You know, it takes a process of working together in relationship building that makes all these collaborations possible.
So thank you, Chelsea. But I think here also on the topic of relationship building as well, and building connections with artists, not just artists that are part of your center as well, but opening up your space to other artists as well would be a program that Prisma runs, Permisi Open Stage. So I thought here I could get Shima to share what exactly is Permisi, why do you all do it, and also why is it important for Prisma to do that?
Why? Okay. Okay. Firstly, I must say I'm very inspired by all of us here, because I'm like a little baby. I think Prisma is really quite cute now because we're transforming, and it's so nice to belong to have such amazing neighbors. I must emphasize that. Also because I feel like when Chelsea was talking about relationship building, and Tianhuan was talking also about, like, just before this, about the desire and the ways of working last time and now, right? I really think a lot about, like, how when we think about artists, you know, like, more and more I feel that artists and everyday people are actually almost equal, and that to see and also to acknowledge the privilege that artists have, you know, to sort of critique and to sort of question is also something that will need a lot of time and space to process. So for Prisma, we have a very small space, but so big in terms of warmth, I feel, because when we sort of started Permisi, I must say Permisi is actually a Malay word for permission. Yep. So Haizat likes to do that, aka Haizat is the AD, but that's not important now. Anyway, but what's important is that Permisi was actually inspired by Ng Kai So Ng Kai she's happily not in Singapore now, which is great. But I think when she opened up her own space, Missy, she actually did sort of like a Missy, like an open, like a Friday night, sort of like an open stage thing. Yeah. So what was amazing about that was that here we are, you know, so we were having conversations, thinking about, like, we have this space here, you know, we have this paid thing here, but nobody comes, you know. It's just like us, like, having a little bit of groupie, and, you know, like, making each other feel good about each other. And we're thinking, like, and we're observing, you know, fellow independent artists, you know, taking time with their own sort of pocket money, bringing people together, like having a non-curated space where people can share anything and everything. And there was so much love and warmth in that. And then we start to really consider, like, okay, having this privilege, you know, how can we then extend and partner and collaborate? So it was so sweet because Kai was she was already moving on, you know, for her studies, and then she was so sweet to, like, donate her studio mats over, and very expensive studio mat, I must tell you, very expensive, you know, and her whole sprung floor system. Of course, we were so touched and deeply, deeply inspired. So we sort of continued Missy, transformed to add the purr in front to sort of really hit some, like why do we have to ask permission if you want to create anything, right? Shouldn't there be a space where anybody and everybody could just do anything that they want? And so this goes on like once in every 2 months where people can sort of like apply. And this application does not have any curation, but it only allows them to have like about a few hours, like 2 hours in space, and then you have 30 minutes to roll. And I always resist having to present them. Like I'm just going to be observed. I'm just going to be a player with you. I don't want to have to introduce. Yeah, because there's no creation. So I think this idea of primacy really sort of also boils down to also how we also have, before we moved into to Stanford Art Center actually, we actually had our own commercial space at Art at Gambas, which was all the way at Sembawang, and we have to like walk 20 minutes to the forest to reach. But actually we had that for a year, before going towards this sort of arts tenancy. But what we found but the testing period for having our own space in Art and Gambas actually taught us a lot about perseverance and a lot about like thinking about how we're going to bring people and whether there's to test. Yeah. So when Permisi came on board, the idea of like there's a lot, and we really believe that little things matter. So the relationship is always based on respect and reciprocity, and that there's always a way that we need to find and listen to each other, especially in performance making. And especially because I'm also trained in Malay folk dance. We never actually had a space. It's always like the void decks, always out in the open outdoor area. So we also thought that life is too short and that everybody should have access, and sharing is of course the way to go lah.
So thank you, Shima. And I think on this topic of, I guess, opening and extending space to others, not just arts practitioners as well, but anyone who's interested in the arts, I think I would direct it back to the theatre practice and Jian Hong. Because I think when we think about the arts ecosystem, we can't just think about arts practitioners, even though they are very important in the ecosystem. But I think we also need to then think about arts audiences, but also the possibility of nurturing future arts practitioners as well. So I thought Jian Hong here, I thought you could share with us, because practice started out as a school, but today your education component is still a very strong program in terms of TTP's kind of mission and vision, and also the core of what you do as well. So I thought you could share, why has it been important for you to keep the arts, that strong component of arts education, and how does it enable you to extend your space out to others?
A few years ago, we did a major restructuring of the company, or rather, before the restructuring, we had a sort of a soul searching, right, to revisit why we're here. Is there any reason to continue? You never assume that you should continue, right? Or should we continue? If so, why? What is it that is, what needs to be done? And at that point, working with Michelle Lim, one of the things that we did was we changed the name of education and outreach into advocacy, right? And actually, it is one of those words that, like, for example, my board of directors, I took a long time to explain to them, because in another industry, it means a very different thing. But for us, when you say advocacy, we go like, oh, yes. Because actually, everything we do is advocacy. It's just you advocate for what, right? Or for who.
And why.
And why. Yeah. So I think, so instead of thinking about educating, then you start recalibrating, the perspective of that. Because in a more traditional way, education is still like, I teach you. There's a power thing, right? But advocacy is, I speak for something, right? Something that I believe in, something that I want to support or speak for, and then you decide where you want to meet me, right? So the idea is then very much about bridging, right? And I think that, so our advocacy program exists, especially during this last 9 months. Actually, our whole existence has been very, very strongly identified with advocacy, because you are advocating for, obviously, the artists, for, the whole idea of, arts institution, art making, like, why do we exist anymore, right? And then also one of the very big thing is like advocating for this whole concept of community. Like, who are we? Where's everybody? How do I find you, Do you need me? You know, and if we meet up somewhere, what do we do? Right? What do you need? Right? So I think the education part exists, or the advocacy part exists, is actually, I think without that, there's really no reason for us, you know, to keep going on, because of course there are people who create for themselves, and I think that's perfectly okay. But as a organization, we are always very prone to reaching out. That's why after we moved here, we're very kaypoh, right? We like started making friends with everybody, you know, go and join the T-Rex with you guys, then got Shima to come over, and then go and, you know, ask you to come and cook with us, you know, at Tuck Shop. And hence, so, you know, with that in mind, it's not just the education side of it, because I suppose the advocacy, in some ways, you look at, you know, like the kids as you walk through the door, is because you're actually reaching out to have dialogue with them when they're young, right? But the advocacy part is also something like, for example, our Tuck Shop, you know, where we continue. I mean, what Shima said just now is really true. It's like, I have a space here, other than me needing to use it to create, then what? Like, who else can I share this with? Like, who do I create anyway? Create for anyway? How do I, you know, have this relationship with them, or build this relationship with them, or like have, you know, this test dating, you know, before they go into the heavy commitment of coming to the theater to see your show? How do I have light, accidental, you know, spontaneous, you know, encounters, right? So it is actually something that is very difficult to do in a sustained, organized way, because spontaneous means spontaneous, ma. How do you organize spontaneous, you know, spontaneity? It's like oxymoron, right?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Jian Hong, for also, I guess, helping us to also further explore the notion of space, but not just kind of physical formal spaces, but also informal spaces as well. Here, I guess I would turn it to Yanling, because when you guys still had 42 Waterloo Streets to yourself, I think one of the important areas in terms of the building were the informal spaces. So, for instance, your courtyard as well. So, where you have always extended the space out, not just to artists that were rehearsing or using your spaces, but basically anyone that maybe wanted to drop by as well. And also holding that space after actual productions for artists together. So why was it important for Center 42 to create such informal spaces?
I don't think it was intentionally, you know, created. It's kind of spontaneous and organic, as with a lot of things that we do. We start with a certain idea or a structure, and it evolves as we respond to the needs of the ground, right? I think what was lovely when we had the space, I guess for context, for some audience who might not know, we've been in the space for about 6 years, and earlier this year in May, we had to return the tenancy of the space back to National Arts Council. But we are coming back to the same plot of land, except at a reduced, I guess, GFA, gross floor area, and we won't be managing the rest of the shared spaces. So that's the background. So with regard to, I guess we were very privileged to be able to manage a few different spaces, which allowed for relationships to build, you know, different artists to come into the spaces and just meet each other out of randomness, and that cross-pollinate ideas, that really helped to form a network and essentially build a community. It also allowed us to get to know who these artists are and kaypoh a bit lah. You're doing this, oh, you're doing something else down the road with someone else. So we had informal spaces like the courtyard, which was not zoned for anything, not even for cars, right? So essentially that question about, we have this big open space, but technically it's not usable.
Technically it's an in-between space that you walk past to get to another space.
Yeah. So I think after a while, when we got familiar with it, we sort of like, you know, if it doesn't break any rules, it doesn't cause a nuisance to the HDB across, why not? And so there were some very nice instances where I guess certain rehearsal groups required that kind of open spaces. I think back in 2015, Nessa, who is a playwright, she did have one of her very first few works, which was revolving around her experience as a motorbike rider, right? So she wrote that play, and she needed a space in which she could actually bring 3 or 4 motorbikes and actually run the ground. So we're like, yeah, sure, use it, you know, and that created some attention for us. And I think there were some other occasions where they had these huge, big puppet props where they had to do an outdoor show for gardens, and they needed that kind of space. Sure, come, use, you know. It's enclosed, so it's private, so technically, as long as we allow them, it wouldn't infringe any other instances. And I think there was one very lovely one where our friends at Drama Box, which then had an inflatable outdoor stage called Goli, I think one of the occasions they're like, we need somewhere where we can actually unfurl it and let it sun and mend this, and we have no idea where to go. We're like, okay, our courtyard fits it, come. So they literally filled up the courtyard, and so these are very lovely moments where, I guess with the restriction of indoor spaces and all, you can't. So that was, yeah, that created more conversations and helped us get to know the rest of the people in the scene as well.
And I like how all your answers also show that how even though we are, you guys are running actual formal spaces, but very often that you allow the space to respond to the needs and also to the needs of the artist, but also the needs of the environment at that point in time as well. But before we go back to the issue of space, I thought I could bring it back to Yanling as well, and also on this idea of nurturing and also the idea of advocacy as well, because we cannot forget that the arts ecosystem not just consists of arts practitioners, arts audiences, but also arts managers as well, who hopefully will be our future, our advocates and enablers of the arts as well. So I thought here, Yanning, you could share about your experiences in terms of this idea of nurturing arts managers, because not only has Center 42 been very generous in terms of offering internships to arts management students, including ones of my own, who I'm proud to say have gone on to actually join the arts as actual arts managers, but also more recently you are involved in, I guess, co-teaching a course with me at SMU on theatre management as well. So why was it important for Center 42 as, I guess, a more theatre development space to think about arts managers and arts management, and for you to venture into these experiences?
I think the crux of it is I'm an arts manager, never had a background in arts management studies, so in a way a bit jealous. But, but I guess the work that we do, my entire team essentially functions as arts managers. We don't have an artistic director, so to speak. And the role as an intermediary in which we bridge all these processes, I find it crucial that we do have the next generation of folks who actually know what it means to hit the ground running, right? And hence in that case, that wish, that desire for students to not only just learn in the classroom, but actually be able to meet the people who are working the ground with or without prior experience, to hear all about it, so they know what they're getting themselves in for, but importantly be inspired that the arts is not just one monolith, idea. It actually has so much depth, complexity, and grittiness in it. So that was I guess why I plunged and took on your offer for teaching this pilot course. But
you will run again.
Hopefully.
And you will teach alone.
Hopefully the students score us well.
Happening right in front of our eyes, is it? Yeah.
But I think over the years also, I guess with your program, we've seen various batches who've come through in different forms, and the ones that really found themselves inspired by the scene actually went on. A few of your students went to TTP as well, right?
And
a few
Prisma as
more.
well.
And Prisma, yeah. So yeah. And I think that besides just arts managers who are, I think for us, we are also looking beyond artists, beyond arts managers, the other practitioners and arts workers that are crucial to support the ecosystem, right? You have
But
your...
we don't really see them.
Yeah, you have your producers, you have your critics, you have your dramaturgs, and you have your documenters, who are very much invisible. And I think we all do need to hold spaces for these disciplines and collaborations as well.
Yeah. And I'm glad Yanling also brought up the issue, I guess the practical realities of hitting the ground running with or without experience, or with or without a kind of formal background as well. Because I think here, even though we talk about, I guess, how important it is to have a space that is responsive to needs, but actually, in reality, it's not that easy to actually run a space and to actually hold space as well. So here I thought I could ask some of you here, what does it actually mean, to actually continue to provide space, especially space for risk-taking, for experimentation, but also failure as well? Anyone?
I can start, because I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question directly, because my brain is going right now. Okay, but I was thinking about a few things that you were saying, and maybe I just throw the idea for other people to discuss also. I like something that Sufan said just now, which is the in-between space, right? The courtyard being the in-between space. And And I think that the in-between space, and another way you call it the liminal space or the threshold, right, is actually the most precious space. You know, is the transition, is a bridge, is where you would accidentally discover something, right? Whether it's mentally or whether it's physically. So I think because we tend to define things very clearly, this is where it ends and this is where it starts. It's the blur in between that is the most precious, right? So I think one of the things that is most challenging is how do you, fight to have those spaces exist, or the possibility of those spaces exist, where it's not defined by GFA, abbreviations. So that's one question that I think we always grapple with. The other thing that I also think about is if you talk about physical spaces, there's actually plenty of corners, right? To, like, for example, you look at our space here, you can divide it into 12 pieces and everybody take one partition and you can go to work, right? But what does it mean? What does it mean to give you actually physical space? What else can we do to support that beyond the physical space? Whether it's to bring people, that is compatible, or to allow the people to articulate what they need beyond the physical space. Is it, people to respond to their work? Is it people to criticize their work? Is it people to support their work? Is it people to mentor? I think that is the other thing, which is because I think a lot of times for artists, talk about residency, right? And for us, it's just that, great, I have a residency, but what does that mean? How do they tell us how much customization, how much can they articulate, or how much ambiguity can we allow for that to happen, right? Again, that's the accidental discovery lah. And then the last thing that I would throw is that how void decks in HDB was conceptualized, where it's just these transitional zones, right? But this is the accidental spaces, or even parade squares or squares. Most of the time when something happens, people go to the squares to converge. In Singapore, I don't know where we'll go. I mean, like what? The Malayan? I don't know, where would it be? I'm actually curious, right? Because conceptually, we don't have this natural converging space. Like, what would that icon, I mean, as a country, what does it mean? Like, is it the Padang? Is it the floating stage? Like, those are the national, official spaces. But in each corner, where would it be? I think that's, and I was thinking about it, what is the iconic square equivalent here? And if that's not there, what does it say about our subconscious, sort of relationship with meeting each other? Where do we interact? Where is the accidental, cross path happening?
And I think that's why having actual physical spaces are important as well, because these are actual tangible meeting grounds for artists together, whether for a formal program, but also to know that, practice is here, Objectives is here, Center 42 is here, and Prisma is at Stanford Arts Center as well, and you know that you can go to these spaces as and when you need, I guess, help or assistance, or even a space to hang out, hopefully. But here I would throw it back to my other panelists in terms of either responding to Jian Hong's questions, but also the points that she raised. Because I think she also brought up a very important point about, I guess, liminal spaces and in-between spaces. But I think all of you here have also tried to go beyond your actual formal spaces and thinking about how to use the different corners in your spaces. So I always remember Objectives, you always have your exhibitions outside as well, not just in your formal gallery spaces. And then for Center 42, you not just use your official kind of rehearsal studios, but also your black box, but also the other spaces in the building as well. And I also like how you also called these spaces shared spaces instead of spaces for tenancy or for rental as well. Yes, anyone?
Just to respond to I think what Yan Ling said just now about arts managers and all that. I really do agree that a lot of times we have so much talent, so much zest for art making, but sometimes the stamina or the perseverance to produce is usually halted by a sense of despair, of thinking about money, and also trying to find ways to create. So I do believe that paying attention to our relationships beyond just the artist is really quite crucial. And I must say that usually for Prisma, like whenever I do a sort of like spine, okay, so we call our administrative team the spine, because if no spine, no movement lah, no body lah, right? So, I mean, the idea of this is also so much so that there's so much love also given to people who believe in the arts as a force of change. And when I talk about arts, I think of it as everything, and that everyone has a say in it. So, with this being said, then going back to the in-between spaces, I was just thinking and like whispering and giggling to Yanling that I was thinking about smoking corner, you know, about like, you know, like makan corner, which then now I know why tuck shop exists lah, you know, because yeah, it's purely this sort of like non-rigidity, sort of cerebral spaces, but really just out of love, out of like this common instinct of having our tummies filled. And like really thinking about how then like our Maslow's hierarchy of needs is actually met. So this just makes me really think about really like deep listening, and a way of etiquette that we sort of like have to really sort of like take a few steps forward. And I love the word soul searching, because ever since Prisma didn't have the seed grant, we have been soul searching. Like really searching, like trying to find souls lah, and also money souls, but also like really considering then like is the company structure a way to go, you know? Like really, like if you have a body, I have a body, like let's just use our body as agency, you know? Do we really have to consider making friends? Yeah, so I think that being said, liminal spaces, in between spaces is really important for us to heighten the awareness of it. And I think therefore, I mean, if you ask Nurhaiza Adam, whenever we do a work in a big theatre space or in a black box, he'll always be wondering like, what's the difference? Like, who am I performing for? I'd rather be able to amaze the uncle or the auntie or this child, you know, that's on the street, you know, and present or introduce that sense of wonderment, than have to be laborious about all the technical processes. So, of course, then this also considers deep listening towards the artists and what do they need for them in their life at this instance. So, with thinking, so I'm very, very awed and also inspired by the residency approaches that Objectives do, because for the longest time, residency has always been like international. Like, you are not cool lah if you don't go overseas, right? Like, you have to go overseas to be cool. You know, then you come back, then people in Singapore like, oh, hello, your name is, right? You know, I mean, so, but actually then this sort of thinking like, why do you have to go out all the time, you know? Like, residency in Geylang is weird. Residency in Jurong West is weird. You know, like, what happened to this sort of like national sort of convergence, which is of course then very integral for managers and artists to come and like have this sparring, you know, rather than just like, I feel like, you know, and then like, okay, but for who? For what, right? So I think this deep listening and this, of course, confrontational sort of approach is necessary for a sense of soul searching.
But here maybe to provide some context, because we brought out the, I guess, the word tuck shop quite a number of times, but maybe to provide some context to our audiences, hopefully new audiences, and who will hopefully come back to visit tuck shop in future. Perhaps Xian Ho, you could explain to us the concept of tuck shop, and why was it important for practice when you moved into 54 Waterloo Street for you to have such a space like that?
Well, I mean, obviously, it first started because we were required to use it as a commercial space. And there was spell out a few things like spa, gym, cafe, F&B, and bookshop, right? I was thinking about doing themed toilets because there are not a lot of public toilets on the street, and then we're very good at set changing and changing lights, right? Yeah. So anyway, those were jokes. One of my colleagues says actually they should just be a Toto station, you know, because the space is so small, right?
Jackpot machine.
Yes, jackpot machine. But we thought a lot about it being a commercial space, and then we decided against it really being commercial, because commercial space basically is just like, I sell you this, I sell you or rent you or lease you this space,
and it's
then
transactional.
It's very transactional, and you take it and then you do it, and your consideration is on profitability, right? And rightly so if you're spending money for it. But for us, we really think about what does it mean to have that space used this way. So we grapple with who and how. Finally, we just decided that we're just going to use this space as a black box with stories, with food, black box with food. So that's where food and stories meet, right? Because food, we're always eating lah, right? We look at all our partners and our sponsors, it's always got to do with food. I don't know why, but the makan part is the best way to communicate and to connect. So we thought food is a way to make it, you know, again, good reason to invite you into break bread with me. But then is that a chance for us to make that first initial spontaneous connection, right? And what stories can we share and tell each other? So that's why with Tuck Shop, it's not F&B entirely because we have a very limited menu, right? It's comfort food. It's very creative food because you construct what you want to eat. But
it's also about food sustainability.
It's about food sustainability. It's a green space because the team running Tuck Shop right now, they really connect with the idea of like what does it mean to even eat and cook and how do we not have wastage and perishable? And they start going down that path and they realize that okay, this is something that we can actually, being very nimble, we can actually do, right? So Tuck Shop is very much about rescued food. It's about, you know, how food is connected to our own everyday life. How we live has to do with how we eat and how we prep food and how we share food, and how does that tell us about ourselves and how do we talk to each other about it. So Chelsea came to do one of the recess time, which is, you know, they cooked and they told stories about why they chose this food, and then everybody who came in to eat also talk about what's food to them. So we wanted to create this space for people to just be comfortable and sit in there and, you know, whatever, right? So that's what Tuck Shop really is about. Yeah.
And for those of you who are curious about Tuck Shop, I believe you have an online recess time after this panel.
Yes, we have an online recess time at 4 o'clock, right? And maybe, you know, my colleague can post the Zoom link to it, and then, you know, today actually is two theatre practitioners who have gone into the food business, you know, but I would think that actually is really about creation with food, right? In the last few months. So they are going to talk about that.
And thank you for all, I guess, especially Shima and also Jian Hong for sharing how you guys also experiment with the idea of physical space, but also holding space as well. But perhaps here we could also discuss what does it mean to actually enable others to take risks, to experiment as well. Anyone? Chelsea?
I think that, you know, what Yan Ling pointed out as to, you know, the importance of good arts management, and also I really appreciate what you said about arts management being the spine of any sort of production, because I mean, being an arts manager myself, I think that rightfully so a lot of the kudos goes towards the sort of artistic talent of a production, but of course it takes so many other people to make it happen. So I think that when we talk about risk, we are not really just talking about artistic risk, especially as people who run spaces. There are so many other considerations that goes into this idea of what it means to enable a certain sort of risk-taking. What does it mean to present a work like that to our audience? How can we help? How can we enable? Or how can we perhaps even inspire this sort of appetite for risks in our audience or in other arts practitioners? And those are the kinds of considerations that we take certainly at Objectives when we think about presenting a work that is perhaps a little bit more challenging, that is perhaps not conventionally understood as, you know, traditional sort of film photography, visual art. And I think that these are also the kinds of responsibilities that you take on when you want to present, when you want to take risk. For us at least, it's never about experimenting for the sake of it. It's about why you want to do it. And that for us helps us unpack why we their need to support it and why we need to present it.
Just jumping in on that, I guess, what does it mean to build that space or to create an conducive environment to experiment, right? I think for us, the key ingredients to all of that is also time and space, and whether we as a organization that holds space has that luxury to do that. Often, or at least when we first started, we built our residencies to be very flexible. I guess the key questions to ask every artist that comes through the door is, why do you want to do this? You know, where do you intend to go? And never, what's the final point? Right? And they are flexible both in terms of scale and time, in that if you need to take that amount of time, then let's revisit the milestone thereafter and then chart the next step. But at least have an overall frame. You have to be rigorous with your, I guess, your planning and your framework, but always allow that little space to maneuver and, you know, chart as you go along. So I guess with all that, right, because that's essentially essential for creation of new work. We do ask at certain check-in points to go like, maybe this experiment should just stop here. What do you think? You know, but let's discuss why. And then, or KIV, till next year to revisit. And I guess for that, the challenge of that is always, how do you articulate the value of this experiment, of this process, right? If you don't see it manifest eventually to a public audience, then has it had any value? Was it valid? Was the entire time, resources put in, you know, what point does it serve? So that's a question we always answer. We always ask, how do we then convey this value, articulate it so that people who may not be so used to process work from the outside, they go, yeah, it's worth experimenting on this. Yeah, so that's a question that you know. Any thoughts?
I think that what you brought up, Yan Ling, with regards to, you know, how do we assess the value of the work, and how do we also, but also how do we set up someone for success? How do we provide the kind of, like Jian Hong mentioned, you know, with a residency, the kind of networking opportunities or mentorship opportunities? What does this practitioner need in order to realize the project or bring that idea to fruition? And I think that is so important. That's a responsibility that we take on also as an art space, to be able to support the artists adequately. And I mean, with regards to, you know, like how do we eventually even present the work to the audience, or do we just acknowledge that this was a process and frame it that way? And I think that again is something that all of us as spaces always need to think about. How do we frame certain programs? This is for public, this is not for public. And there's always that kind of demarcation, I think, that we need to play with. And at the end of it all, we all have stakeholders to be accountable to.
And I think these are very important questions as well, because I guess in today where we are always thinking about KPIs and also how do we report. And also, I guess when Yan Ling and also Chelsea shared, it also brings up the question, did it really happen if, you know, there's no actual tangible outcome as well? And how do we then justify, you know, spending the amount of resources and effort and time that goes behind, you know, whatever process that just happened as well? Here, perhaps I could ask either Shima or Jian Hong to share as well, because I think both of you will offer different perspectives as well as I guess, Shima, you guys also experiment with the notion of what does it mean to be that traditional dance, but also contemporary dance as well. And like you mentioned in your introduction as well, what does it even mean to call yourself Malay as well? And also Jian Hong with, I guess, institutional baggage as well. How do you then also support or nurture an environment for risk and experimentation as well? And do you consider it failure if, you know, an actual kind of tangible outcome does not happen? Shima?
You want to think, is it?
Yeah.
Think, yeah.
Still got time, okay. Still got 1 hour. Okay.
I still got 1 hour. Yes.
The clock is very useful. Okay. I mean, I think I I love asking questions, like difficult ones, you know. I'll
But
be
now
like,
you have to answer.
yes, now I answer. But the truth is that just listening to talking about how residency and the milestones and all that. If you work with because in Prisma we also have an incubation program for our associates for catalysts, and the reason why we are keeping it to only associates is so because we're very new to this, so we don't want to hurt people. So we kind of like want to keep it small and test lah. Because the truth is we don't have a degree in art management or like even in dance lah, you know. So most of the time it's like it's really us working through that toy with people that we love and then finding ways. So when you talk about risk and experimentation, it's really pretty important to also consider how like it's very ironic, or if you observe that we're actually very severe for art making in Singapore. Like the moment you create something and there's not enough people come, then yeah, you're like doomed, you know. And this sort of conversations that I have with a lot of, I guess, emerging artists, especially those who are just graduated in terms of performance making, there's so much fear in failure, and there's so much like, oh no, like I don't have good collaborators, oh my dancers cannot dance well, you know, things like that. I don't have money to pay them, you know, and there's so much fear in this, which sort of like makes it almost impossible for them to take a step forward and take risk. So I feel that it's pretty important that we also help our community and managers or stakeholders understand that there is a need for growth and there's a need for a body of work, and not just like one single work and then it's do or die, and then forever like this artist is doomed in a way. So, and this is also pretty much, I guess, to also note that there is also then our responsibility as art spaces, as managers, as just people to communicate at the kopi shop to everybody. They're like, relax like, you know, like you don't like it lah. Not only for you, you know, like kind of like make it very clear that there is, of course, the idea that if we live as an artist who only creates to serve people's needs, then we will not be able to craft our personality and not also hold space for other personalities. So it's pretty important that I do feel that when you mention about failures, I see it as useful failures. The more failures you have, the better. You know, Haiza will always tell me, every work that you do, right, will always be a failure. In your eye, it will never be perfect, you know, but the form is the rigor to like continue to listen and really work on it, and then and to a certain extent just drop, leave it and work on something else. That takes a lot of courage also. So giving spaces like this is important, and I think for Prisma there's always a lot of listening that has to be done and a lot of communicating, which might not actually be by words. Yeah.
Here, I will also throw the spotlight back on Chelsea and Yeling, as well as, I guess, Jian Ho thinks about her response. Because I think you guys brought up very valid questions. How do you account for the value of process work, or how do you account for the time taken and the resources taken for experimentation as well? How do you guys actually account for it? And or how do you guys actually report back to your stakeholders? But maybe we'll hear from Jian Hong first.
Oh, okay. I think that, you know when we were first started talking about this group, right, the proposed title I gave was In Search of Failures. Remember that? Yeah. And then like but sometimes, you know, some people just don't go so far lah. But I actually realized that at some point the reason I proposed that is I realized that every day when I go into rehearsal, I'm actually looking for failure. Because if I don't find the failure of today, there's no reason for me to come back tomorrow. Right? So there must be something that I feel like, okay, it's not working well for me. Right? It's not working right yet for me. So I have to come back tomorrow. Else there's no that means it's a full stop. Right? But for people who like us who really, really savor that process of discovery, the failure is exactly what keeps us going. And if there's no more, you know, spots that needs work on, then I think that will be just the end for me. Right? So I totally agree with Shima that everything is about whether you can ask that hard questions that you don't have answers, or the answers keeps, you know, evolving. So I think for me, I think that, you know, for lack of just for reference, right? If we think about this in a binary way, it's much more than binary, right? But if we think about it in a binary way, you know, we talk about failure. How do you, you know, justify or account for success or failure. Why should you do that? Why should you not do that? And the other thing that you mentioned that I totally agree with is about communication. Because in order to take risk, you have to be safe. You have to feel safe enough to take risk. That is, in some ways, a binary relationship. In order to be free, you actually need structure. Or else you wander everywhere. Then there's no such thing as free because there's no reference point, right? In order to have time, that means you also have to have a sense of end of time, right? So these are very abstract things. How do you frame it? How do you define it? How do you customize it, right? And who's responsible for doing that? So one of the things that I often have to take a lot of time to explain to, even we have the associate artist program, right? Right now we have four associate artists, when we five, not four. Somebody's gonna get pissed off at me when I say four. But anyway, when we do the associate artist program, we don't structure in a way and says, oh, you got to do these things. They do have things that they have to do. For example, they have to do sharing with the whole company. They have to do 2 to 3 sharing. That is so that we learn together, right? They have to take part in like Artist Farm, which is our sort of a boot camp every year. But there is very little KPIs. And when new artists come in, they sometimes feel a little bit lost. Like, what do you mean I can be associate artist? You're going to support me, but then what can I do for you, right? What do you expect from me? Do I feel like this unsettling idea that do I owe you? Right, it's horrible if I don't know what I owe you, right? I don't even know what the numbers are. So how much do I owe you, right? And so it's one of those things that the openness can be very unsettling, especially for us Singaporeans. Yeah. But then I also think that if I define it for you, then I just say, hey, I got a production's opening on this day. Why don't you just come and do this role? Then is my work. It's not your work, right? But how do we arrive at that? Each person is going to have different needs. Each project is going to have different needs. So, which means the space that you really want, you are actually responsible for both sides to communicate it and to keep talking about it, and sometimes to agree that actually we're not compatible at this point, right? But the compatibility, and that's something else that Ian Ling mentioned just now. The word for us is actually values, or another way to look at it is the ethics, right? The ethics of art making. So, frankly, when you talk about space, whether it's physical or creative or spiritual or mental or emotional, there's actually politics of space. And in some ways we kind of, as a community, in different classes, we have to decide, how do we want to shape this together? It doesn't mean that we ought to be synchronized, but what is that effort? How do we continue to evolve and massage this process of discovering where do we find the compatibilities among us?
And I think this brings up also, I guess, going back to Chelsea and Yeling and my question earlier, how do you have these difficult questions, particularly in terms of accounting and also reporting back to your stakeholders? See, Chelsea's not picking up the mic.
I'm looking at the audience and nobody's asking questions. So
are there anybody?
I'm not playing
No,
games on my
I keep
handphone.
looking as well.
Yeah.
Very serious the topic.
Or any comments that people may have, right? Like so far I'm helping, to fill up the time. Is it?
I think for us primarily is to try to convince that the process itself is an output. And I'm putting it very crudely, right? Because I usually say production operates as an output. But so I guess for us, one way of doing it is to actually always document each residency, even though the residency doesn't go into any form of showing private, closed door, or public. So that was our baseline commitment from the artists who choose to do residency with us. We want a commitment to be able to document this with your input, of course, however way you find it most suitable to your practice, to your process. So then that serves as a record, for the very least, to then still be able to take it out later, sometime later, to talk about it. And sometimes this work serves as a very introspective for the artist to then look back and say, oh, okay, I did this failed one before. And you never know where the learnings from there actually go on to. So that's one form. And sometimes it's an opportunity for us to, when presenters come to us, they say anybody interesting. Then we're like, hey, take a look at this one. They really just wanted to experiment with text and body, for example. Maybe there's an opportunity that aligns with you 2 years down the road. You might want to pick it up. Then take on that conversation later. So primarily for us to keep a proper documentation, which can be accessed publicly online. Yeah. So that's my first.
Chelsea?
Documentation for us is also incredibly important. That there is certainly value there in being able to look back and then sort of chart someone's progress in a way. For us, we usually do try to have some sort of public outcome, but then the outcome is not the focus. The focus is really the process. So, if I could cite an example, one example would be we run a youth mentorship photography program called the Shooting Home Youth Awards. So this is where a group of young people, 12 young people, they go through a sort of 2-month-long mentorship process with us, and then at the end of the day, they have an exhibition. But really, the exhibition is not the focus here. The focus is really the mentorship, and it's also to have the participants understand that and not have that burden of having to think about the exhibition from the onset, as a sort of final output of the mentorship program. Our aim here is for them to focus really on the mentorship. And in order to do that, I think that your whole team needs to be on board. All your mentors need to be on board. It's like, hey, dudes, the purpose here is not to have an exhibition in the lower gallery at the end of the day. Even though yes, that's a very important public component, but the first thing is you need to get your story right. You need to get we want to work on your process. We want to work with you to develop your own voice, and that takes buy-in. And I'm also reminded of what Yan Ling said earlier, that sort of experimentation is luxury, is a luxury of time and space. Right now with the Women's Artist Residency Program, the residents aren't actually expected to have any sort of final output. And this is like, wow, you mean don't need lah? So that kind of, that being freed from that kind of burden of having to produce something is so unusual, because we are always so consumed with this idea of what are they going to see, what was the purpose of this, how can we quantify a certain experience. And the fact of the matter is it cannot always be quantified. We hope that it will bear fruit further down the road, but it's an investment that you put in, that you make in artists.
And I think here also, it also brings us back to a point that Jian Hong also earlier raised as well, in terms of how do you provide a safe space for your artists to dare to experiment, to dare to take risks as well. Because I think, like Jian Hong, you also rightly mentioned, I think in Singapore we are very afraid, or I think the fears come more naturally than being that, or having that openness to encourage, to dare to be different, to experiment as well. So I was wondering, how do you guys create safe spaces for your artists, but also your audiences as well, and maybe your own staff as well, to enable this kind of conducive environment for risk and experiment and failure as well?
Maybe I can start with the artist farm. Right? It sounds very nice, like it's a farm, but actually it's like more like a boot camp. It's maybe just an introduction of it. It's a 1-week residency. It sounds very nice too. We have artists that we invite from different disciplines, different places, different parts of the world. Right? There are certain qualifications, or rather qualities with them that we look for. One is the person must be interested in collaboration, right? The second is the person must be interested in creation. 3, the person ideally is hyphenated. In other words, you have more than one interest or skill, so that you can cross, right? Because if you only know what you know and you can't go beyond what you know, then, And I think the 4th thing is that we look for people with different experiences and backgrounds, so there's diversity. And then the last thing is that a relative, guess of alignment of ethics, right? Because that actually is the hardest one to read on CV, even in a short conversation. So when we gather them together, usually we look at 9 artists and then 3 dramaturgs, documenters that go along. So this is actually our attempt at some of the things that you talk about, which is documentation. Because I think for many years, the hardest thing for us has been documentation. Because you are creating, and then you are pulled by the curiosity to create, and you're running after that light, right? And then after a while, you turn around like, wow, where did I come from? What trail did I just leave behind? It's very difficult to recapture that. So with this 9 artists, what happens is they meet every day. They will share, each other's curiosity in this moment or whatever they want to share, and then they will jam. Okay, they will jam. There are certain guidelines in terms of a structure that I provide for them to jam within, because if you're jamming is just like anything goes, then actually nothing goes, right? So the idea is, I won't go into the detail of those parameters, but when they jam, they present on Friday, and then on Saturday for 2 days. I think on Sunday too. They do 3 presentations. Every time they do a presentation, they go back and they regroup and rethink and come back and say, do I want to try something different? So when the audience comes in, the audience are not audiences. They are there to see, but they're also there to dialogue. And the audience also have certain parameters of how we dialogue, right? So that we have the same set of vocabularies or same, objective of what this is. So don't come in as an audience and say, I think I like it louder, because it's not what you like. It's actually about understanding what the intent of the artist is. Once you understand the intent, then you can criticize and feedback based on the intent, not based on your taste, right? So the reason why I give this an example is because I think sometimes it's about us trying to find vocabularies and framework where we can agree and work within, and then to understand that, because actually the truth is, when you create, whether it's called a product or not, it is about somebody has to see it. That gaze completes the work, right? Whether it's a rehearsal, whether it's work in progress, whether it's a draft, whether it's a finished product, it needs to have this. It goes out, it comes like that ping, in computer in terms, it has to ping each other, right? So when they are pinging, do we understand what the pinging is meant for? And if you understand what the pinging is, okay, then it contextualizes. So like, for example, in film, if I tell you it's a rough cut, do you understand what that means? If you don't understand what the rough cut is, then you say, why the music not, and sing the color not the same, right? Because it hasn't been corrected yet, right? So if we can define those, what you're looking for, don't look for what's not there, right? But if you understand that's what I'm searching for, and you can see it from my lens, then there's a better shot at framing a common platform that we can dialogue on, or else it will be all over the place lah. So I think that's something that, it's an ongoing, negotiation. Sometimes we miss. Sometimes we find a very nice threshold where these things can happen.
So, and I think here also, just maybe to add on, I think what's nice about Artist Farm is also that giving the audience a chance or a glimpse behind the scenes in terms of what does it mean to actually develop a process work, and also the importance of feedback in terms of improving the process work. Because I remember this year in particular, because Artist Farm was online, then I had some of my students attend, and then for the first time ever, they managed to go beyond the classroom and see what does it actually mean for artists to even try to work together within a short period of time as well. So I think in terms of a program to support a safe space, it's not just for artists but also for audiences as well, to be used to the idea that actually art making very often needs time for process, and also time for refinement, and also, I guess, hopefully improvement as well. But what about the rest of you? What does it mean for you guys to kind of create safe spaces for either your artists or your staff, or even for your audiences as well, to embrace this spirit of experimentation and risk?
For us, it goes back. I think that what Shima said about that, the importance of listening. I think it's so key to be able to. It's so key to a safe space, in that you need to really understand the needs of your collaborator, the needs of your artist, to be able to make them feel safe, to enable them to then experiment. And also this idea of pinging, which is something I really resonate with, in that, in making a work, that sort of, that kind of feedback that you get with or that kind of the collaboration that you seek, and in that getting feedback, in that collaboration, I mean, this idea of trust really is key, right? And this is what we, for us at Objectives at least, you know, this is what constitutes a safe space for us. The ability to listen and to be able to provide a space where people can be surrounded by people whom they trust, who understand what they are trying to do, who understand that kind of vocabulary, like, hey, your thing not color graded. I mean, that's not really what I'm going for here, right? I mean, I want to seek feedback on the narrative, on the editing, on the flow, and not have you pick up on all these things. So, I mean, so it's that kind of environment, I think, that is really key for enabling experimentation.
Yelling.
For us, I think what we've learned is that the idea of safe space is always two-way, especially when we're working with pretty much a diverse range of artists from different disciplines as well. And it's like a mutual respect. We have to earn it as well. They have to trust us as much as we have to trust them. So I go back to what Tian Hong said, alignment of ethics. Because it is, I mean, we form a certain culture, but the culture also grows and evolves with the more and more people that comes into it and builds it. So I guess for us, maybe just drilling down specifics, we are quite clear with our structures of what we can offer to support. And that's when we use that as a base to go, okay, this is what is on the table. What we strive to do is to be as transparent and open at the onset. Do you agree to be, here with us? And a lot of the artists that work are very, I guess, independent artists, but also very independent in driving and charting their own work. So we say, we're not going to babysit, but we can work together with you. We're going to leave you the spaces. You also have to take care of it so that you can benefit the rest of the artists. So I think it's a two-way, and communication is always very, very essential to be able to start building that trust and relationship.
Shima?
I think essentially is to sort of go back to just like looking into each other in the eye and like acknowledging that like how are you, like how's your body feeling today, like is this really what you need in your life right now? I'm always asking this question. Okay, yeah, I should have asked that question earlier, but I mean, I always really try my very best to help and also give space for others to lead, because I do find that I guess I'm in a very unique position because I'm also a practitioner and also managing at the same time. So my conversation with stakeholder is always on the premise that I know what it takes, to do something, and so don't tell me that that this is what you need, because you need us as much as we need you. So it's always a very sort of very firm conversation. But whenever it's always talking to artists, I always try my very best to position that a safe space also needs confrontation. A safe space also needs difficult conversation. And a safe space is always about always reacting in a way where we already believe that we have each other's interests at heart, and that where you want to go, we are parallel. Yeah. So our end goal might not actually be might be in the same parallel vision, but we might not actually want the same thing. But how we can actually set up, like what you mentioned, the frames of success, how can we set up, certain lines, certain helplines, certain ways of just giving them space to decide, and not insist on rushing. It's pretty much also a really deep sense of personality. I was just talking a lot about performance making, and we were exploring about didactic and collaborative methods, right? All the textbook words. But the big thing that I was really thinking about is actually, can that be a personality? Can it not be something that it's instructional, but more like what Jian Hong was mentioning, where it's become something that you advocate for, where collaboration is a personality that you develop and you learn, and it's a form of skill. So I think in creating a safe space, it's pretty much really about human sort of embodiment, and about the ways and really actually very, very true. It's just love language lah. How you express love for each other is really very different. Like how you see, how someone sees that you care for them is never really the same way as how others. So you might actually be telling the artist, I care for you, I care for you. But if you don't makan with them, they will always think that, they just want me to do work. You know. So you have to find a way to also identify what's the love language of different personalities within your community. Yep.
That's why you tuck shop eats, huh? I mean, it goes back to food, right? But it's funny because when Shima was talking there, I poked Chelsea. I said I wrote human, and then she said care, and then you say care. You know, I think it's the same.
Care.
Yeah, I mean it's. Yeah, it's a street. It's the human care street, right? But I think what Shima said is, I totally agree. I mean, sometimes I use this analogy like a relationship, right? Like you can look for, just a date, a one-night stand, but you can also look for a much more, engaged relationship. But that's messy, right? I think this kind of relationship is messy, and you got to, not being afraid to confront and have conflict. But that can only happen if there's something you want. Right, and you understand that in this equation you have responsibility and you also have power, right? I mean, I think a lot of times with residency, people say, "Oh, you grant me the residency." No, residency for me doesn't make any sense if you don't want to come here, right? It is actually a two-way street. I need you as much as you need me, and if this symbiotic relationship is not established, then it doesn't work, right? Because certainly we're not looking for you to fulfill KPI, right? So I think it really is about how do you confront each other vigorously so that you can have as much clarity at each point as possible. It's not possible to have complete, because there's no such a thing. Every time you discover something that you don't know, right? So are you going to hold, are we going to hold two ends of this rope and hold it tight? But it takes, like when we're doing artist farm, I always say you have to fight. If you don't fight, it doesn't work. You have to lean and push each other hard enough for it to be strong. And if it's light engagement, it's just like touch, you're not leveraging on each other. So it is messy. But do we have the appetite for that?
And I think this also then goes back to the point about how all art and art making is relational as well, and then and that messiness is a huge component about in that kind of relational process as well. But I thank Shima and also Jian Hong for bringing up the topic of difficult questions and needing to confront these difficult and messy questions sometimes. Because here I thought it might be also useful to talk about some of the limitations and challenges in terms of holding and making space for the arts. And here I would turn to Yanling, because I think when we talk about space, and we've talked so much about physical space in particular, but in reality, like you mentioned earlier on in the year, it was announced that Center 42 had to return 42 Waterloo Street to the National Arts Council. So how has that loss of space actually affected Center 42's ability to make and hold space? Or has it actually challenged you guys to pivot in a different way?
We are still in the process of figuring out, because as you know, we all haven't been able to return to the space. But yes, the initial bit did cause us to stumble quite a fair bit, because we've spent so many years building this model of holding space, allowing space to feed into all the work that we do for artists. So the loss of it, and when I say loss, it's actually loss of the control or flexibility to use the spaces however we want to serve the programs, right? It was quite disarming. And I think that the artists that we've been working with do feel that, and it all came out quite emotionally. But that said, we are also trying to look towards another lens to it, and hopefully we do get back to the space next year after the renovations. We do still get access to the spaces. The spaces have been promised to retain its functions for rehearsals, performances. It's just that it's under a different management, right? So the practical challenges is that we now have to jump through quite a few other hoops, so that we can bridge this and still retain what we have previously done with work with the artists. We now have to just communicate with another party to do that. So that is still yet to pan out. We only have a desire to try to make it work. We'll probably need to spend the next, I don't know, year to sort out any teething problems with logistical operations and all. But I mean, all those, half of it is for us to chart. The other half is for, I guess, the Arts Resource Hub to also define how they want to work with us. If they still want to retain that community, that, you know, that safe space for arts creation, right? But we have, I guess in the last couple of months, tried to reframe our residencies such that perhaps they are not so much physical space reliant. They are a bit more flexible in terms of schedules. They can also operate on a hybrid, perhaps, because we work in the incubation phase of things. A lot of times with artists, some of them have feedback that say, you know, part of the work can actually be done through meetings online, just in your office. We don't need the floor space as much. So we kind of are restricted by that way, but it's possible. Yeah, we're still figuring, we're not sort of figuring out, we sort of figure out a model, but we are just waiting to test it. The other upside of things is that a lot of our friends and, you know, partner organizations have said that, you know, we have the spaces, can we work something out as well? So then now we are not confined to just one location, we have multitudes of locations. So that's a good thing that we can expand the collaborations with.
But I think this predicament or this situation of Center 42 also, I guess, points to the reality that actually all your spaces are actually non-permanent as well. Because all of you actually lease the space and pay rental to the National Arts Council. And for those of you who might need a bit more context, this is because all of your spaces actually fall under the Arts Housing Scheme, which was first started in 1985 to provide affordable workspaces to artists and arts groups as well. And in December 2010, the Arts Housing Scheme was then updated to the framework for art spaces as well. But I think one of the benefits that we cannot deny is that this policy has actually afforded all of you guys heavy rental subsidies as well, and also the opportunity to be located in quite central locations as well. But again, there are always downsides as well, and I think one of the kind of stark downsides is actually the precarity and the uncertainty of these short-term leases as well, and not knowing when maybe your space will be taken back, or you might need to co-share the space as well. So I was wondering whether you guys had any thoughts on, you know, how has this kind of short-term leases, but also the precarity, how has that affected your ability to make and hold space, and how do you actually work around it? Because it brings us back to Jian Hong's, I guess my first question posed to you, right? We can never escape, I guess, this uncertainty and precarity of spaces.
Well, we cannot escape
space.
the uncertainty of life, right? And so, I mean, obviously, you know, that being the frame, our resilience within us will make us just keep going on. You take away money, okay, I find some way. You take away space, okay, I find some way. You take away people, okay, I also find some way, right? So that does, you know, it's just the mode of existence, right? But we're not talking about how, like, for example, what Yan Ling's saying. I think that, you know, even Alvin Tan saying, okay, then I will just, you know, I don't need a space. I find some other way for TNS. As much as I admire the courage, but on a more principle level, I find it very disempowering. You know, I find it very disempowering that we are sort of like at the mercy of some invisible hand that we really don't know. Right? I mean, yeah, you know, we have this joke about, okay, us being non-essential, and some of us are very bitter about it. But I actually do think that is really actually boils down to what is our relationship in this country. You know, what are the policies that, you know, how they look at us, when they tell us to go and when they ask us to stay, and what is our involvement in that process? What, as a community, whether it's the arts community or as, you know, a social community, as a people, what is that? How are we important or not? Or how can we be useful or not? And on what terms are we going to, you know, choose to pursue something or not? So I think that this thing with what happened with C42 was quite, you know, depressing for many of us. You know, you feel very helpless, and you feel like sometimes like, oh yeah, do for what? You know, one day the tsunami comes and then it will just be wiped out. You can't, you know. So I feel that then it's really you know, we are still not giving up. I mean, we've been trying to have dialogues. We have been trying to also, you know, while that is happening, you know, immediately, what can we do? Right? I think that's the immediate action. But that is still, you know, sort of like patching, you know, patching the hole. But how do we even look at why the hole is there in the first place? You know? And so I think I don't have an answer. I really don't have an answer because it's much larger than us here. It's much larger than that. But I think amongst all of us, I think there's also obviously soul searching lah, right? Like, what kind of model amongst all of us can we, you know, develop or adapt or attempt to, you know, grow that allows us to have more control the way we want it to have, right? I mean, that's why we are even here, sitting here. I mean, we all know of each other, we all know each other and growing and mingling, but how do we make it more of a sustained effort? You know, like, you know, the chopstick story that we all learned when we were kids, right? Like, one chopstick break, you know, a bunch of chopsticks don't break. Then, of course, now people say, like, why you break chopsticks? Which actually is my question, why we want to break chopsticks, right? We're quite useful, right? So it goes back to, but meanwhile, while somebody's breaking chopsticks, then how do we be one bunch, lor? You know?
Any thought?
Yes, I think. I mean, right now, Objectives is at the in the middle of its 3+3 plus 3 lease. So and that's how the Art Center scheme works, right? It's tenants have a sort of roll-on agreement to occupy the space for 9 years, after which the space is up for open tender again. So Middle Road will be up for tender again in 2024. And that's something that's hanging over our heads at the moment. It's honestly quite a stressful position to be in, because I guess as an organization that has seen so much growth since moving to Middle Road, we don't want for that to be taken away from us. And then that goes back to what Jian Hong said, you know, what is the relationship here? What is the purpose of this art center scheme? Why does it sort of benefit? How does it work to benefit these sort of mid-sized organizations? But then at the end of 9 years, essentially cut their feet away by taking the space back. And that is like I said, is frustrating to be in, position to be in. But at the same time, I think it goes back to what Jian Hong was saying earlier as to why do we then continue. And this sort of soul searching is really so important, and it's really, you know, as organizations that support a community that is always changing, our purpose therefore is also always changing. And these sorts of crises are also an opportunity for us to look at why we exist. And I feel like as long as we can understand the why, as long as we can answer the why, then we can also then figure out the how. We have existed in so many spaces, smaller, more expensive than before. We can make it happen again, but we need to find within ourselves the answer as to why.
And I think here I will also bring up that I guess from the kind of uncertainty and precarity of the short-term leases as well. But to be honest, I think a lot of terms and conditions also come with being able to lease these spaces as well. From things, from words that we hear, such as the 3+3+3 kind of tenancy, and also the uncertainty of what happens after the 3+3+3 ends. But also this kind of buzzwords such as, you know, space optimization, space maximization, and also placemaking as well. Because I think here within the last kind of few minutes as well, I thought it might be useful for us to discuss, you know, what does it actually mean for all of you to be located on the same street together. does it actually even matter to be on the same street together? Because I think this also brings me to, I guess, a kind of larger topic where there's always this kind of romantic notion where if you kind of throw or cluster creatives together, then, naturally there'll be other kind of spillover benefits, and there'll be, this sense of vibrancy or sense of, I guess, placemaking as well, or even sense of community as well. But I'm also always reminded then of something that I guess one of our friends, Angela Leong from Arts Vision, always has told me as well. You don't marry your next door neighbor just because he's next door, right? So I was then wondering, what does it actually mean for you guys to be located on the same street together? Or does it not matter?
I mean, I totally agree that you don't, marry your next door neighbor, but you can share food and you can borrow salt, right? So the function again goes back to that organic process that you discover, and obviously there's desires but then you cannot define which desire is more worthy than the others Sometimes I just want to borrow salt right? I'm not looking for somebody to marry. So I think that the fact that we're again human, right? And this is a very human. I mean, I think art making is highly personal. It needs to be highly personal, but yet it's not selfish, right? It has to start from us, each individual, to find the reason to doing it. Then it will go from there. So I think, to me, I feel that maybe the thing I've been thinking about is really about this idea of where is the space, right? Where is the space? And I think the street makes a huge difference, because sometimes we do feel very lonely. I think we feel lonely as artists. I feel lonely as arts organization, and having this kind of a community, a community is a very, very ambiguous word, but this is a community because of physical proximity first, right? It helps for us to, make decisions as to, I borrow salt, you borrow honey, then I borrow sugar. I don't borrow the same thing from, everybody, and it allows us to identify how we best contribute, and it's not always the same. Right, how we best connect is not always, it changes. So I do think that being on the street does make a difference, but then whether that's something that we're allowed to discover, or there's something that's dictated, what's the expectations, and how do we come to an agreement with the expectation being amicable and evolving for, two parties or more.
How about Jian Hong's neighbors? What does it mean for you guys to be located on Waterloo Street together?
Okay. Actually, I do. I mean, we were taken in by the romantic notion that to be cool, you must be here. Okay, because like I said, I think for Haizat and myself, we both really started at void decks, at community centres. A lot of folk dance communities also are actually still existing within the community centre spaces. And so there's this allegiance, which then for us to move out into this street, it's actually a form of rebellion to some of them. But I think what we do enjoy is also the learning and growing and observing how then different sort of disciplines and different sort of organizations also work and process. So just being here and also like making friends, with everybody here, I think it really makes us a little bit more aware of the luxury of space, and also the privilege that we have in also framing the dialogue around art making. I really like how, people always say that, oh, you all do so many things, but I don't understand what you're doing. That's usually the sort of thing that we get, like, what you're doing, dance here, dance there, I don't know what. But I think it also boils back down to also like helping people understand and having that sort of like a bouncing sort of board, a testing, a sort of like, real sort of conversations with other practitioners and also organizations. And then it becomes also like, in a way, also observing, and not just only listening to artists, but also observing and listening to what everyone else needs. Because I think what happened to C42, I really called like a spine meeting, like, hey, everybody come. Ice cream, you know, and like, hey guys, hello, like, you know, like why are we still doing this? You know, like we're talking about the death of spaces actually during the COVID period, like the death of theatre, you know, and what must we let die to continue art making together with Ming. We had that sort of conversation. And this was a very important point in our in sort of our growth and to identify as a community of art makers, which needs everyone. So I really like the chopstick story because I really do find that, like, you know, you really gotta stand up for each other. You know, really gotta be able to not only stand up through, of course, the IG way, but also to really talk to stakeholders and really let you know that we need them in order to do what we do. You know, the sort of documentation that you do in C42, I tell you the truth. Previously, we just like gele, you know, never do anything, never document lah, just like ha ha he he, you know. But then we realize that, hey, we really don't know what the sort of instruction that we do in the sort of rehearsal processes is so important for people to understand the quick and deep-rooted decisions that art practitioners make, which then you would think that it's just the leg just go up nothing you know. So it's pretty important for me right now to really sort of pay attention to everyone around this street. And I think previously it is very lonely. It is a very personal and lonely process, and we're not even just talking about money. We're just talking about having that grit and appetite to really just sort of consistently search for the whys and hows, and that requires a lot of motivation actually. Yeah, and we have to actually go out and actually go and ask and search for that kind of stamina. Yeah.
But I think here also Shima and also Jian Hong, you also brought up a good point where I guess it also, the arts organization or yourselves also must be willing to step out of your own kind of solidarity kind of space to want to make friends with others and also want to know who your neighbors are as well. But here I would throw it back to Chelsea or Yan Ling as well. Does being neighbors with them actually matter to you guys? And how has it actually maybe, or what do you actually do to maybe strengthen your connections and relationships with each other? Or you could be located in Yishun and it doesn't matter.
I don't want to be located in Yishun. I mean, the short of it is, of course it matters, and I think we learn as we go along how much more important it is. Even just being able to walk down the street, knock on doors, and say, "Let's have a chat." You know, amongst all the busy schedules and all that, it is so precious because I think at the crux of it, we are support opportunities for each other, and there's always strength in numbers, right? And sometimes when we are so focused on our own problems and challenges, we lose sight of, oh, okay, maybe someone else is also facing this, or someone else has figured a way out. And that's when we discover, oh, okay, maybe we should strategize and take this other approach, or share notes and learn from each other. So I think for me, the crux of it is the beauty of that connection. And just because we are sited along the same street, we understand the context, we understand the larger issues or larger forces that are at play, and we can then strategize. So beyond the boring salt and sugar and all that, which is great, we are sharing also physical resources, right? We have at many points in the last few years, Chelsea and I, we have been arranging to bring structures down this street, up and down. And then that also sparked conversation with the uncles, like, why are these ladies, you know, like 4 ladies carrying steel structures across? Yeah.
And it's mostly ladies. Yeah.
Yeah, all
so
ladies here, yes.
This okay, never mind. Let's not go into that. Let's not go into that. That's another conversation to be had. Yeah.
But maybe Chelsea, you want to respond?
I think that, you know, at the end of the day, physical proximity is so important. But I also think that we value our physical proximity because we have shared values. And this is what has really brought us together here. I mean, there's something within each of our organizations that has resonated with the others, and you know, this sense of openness and wanting to learn, and coming from the same place of care and love for the community, that I think that has been so valuable and so nurturing. I mean, even if we were to be sited at some other very central location, I don't think that we would have been able to get as much out of our relationships with our neighbors. But you know, it's somehow the kind of feng shui and synergy has brought us together, and it's been actually a really lovely relationship. You know, being down from TDP, Center 42, to have Pisma across the road, and just knowing that you have people there who have your back. That kind of mental and emotional support is invaluable.
I would just maybe just add one point that also the artists themselves, we do share artists, as in they do different disciplines and they go to different approaches, and knowing that we have this support structure also allows us to direct the artists to go, hey, why don't for this particular project, what you might need, you might look for this other organization down the street, and they love it because they're just roaming the streets.
Sometimes we point them, sometimes they point us, right?
True, yeah.
But I think the freelancers is actually a very important part of the ecosystem. They are like the worker bees or the worker ants that you know, cross-pollinate, right? And it allows us to actually, you know, communicate like they are the carrier of the ping, right? But I think in some ways, I feel that as we are talking about this, you know, I was thinking about the two things that we talk about today, which is the physical space as well as the creative space, for, you know, like more encompassing word, creative space, right? And I think that for us, you know, the challenge with physical spaces, obviously it's still very important because, you know, us being in the same physical space, there's energy transference, and you're reading much more than a rectangular frame or just a voice. You're reading much more subtle and complex cues, and you are transmitting, you know, information and knowledge that's beyond just the very tangible words, right? So I think that the physical space, but it's limited, you know, because there's the mileage, the square footage is only that big. So I think our challenges is how to make the limitation of physical space larger than it is, right? And then on the other hand, creative space in each one of them should be infinite, right? It should be infinite. Then the challenge is how do we make these infinite spaces specific, right? So I think they're kind of going in opposite direction, but where it, you know, intersects, it's the sweet spot, right? And I think that is an ongoing search. Yeah.
And I think what you guys shared about, you know, the alliance between you guys, but also I guess the mental but physical kind of support that you offer each other as well. I think this also helps us to clarify, I think, some of the, I guess, mismanaged expectations of what it means to placemake an area as well, where we often think about placemaking as, I guess, drawing audiences in and footfall in as well. But actually, it's also about building connections with your neighbors as well, and wanting to build up the connections as well, and also the time and effort that it takes to build up those kind of strong alliances and connections between the neighbors as well. Because if Shima didn't cross the road, you know, she would still be alone in
Yeah,
SAC
why
there.
does Shima cross the road, right? Yeah. For chopsticks, yeah.
You
She's
got
only
two
one.
what?
She needs two.
But you're in
Unless you're eating fish ball.
Yeah, but here I think I would want to, I guess, start to end the conversation by maybe thinking beyond ourselves as well, and because I think we're all, we are strengthened by the numbers and your alliance together. I think there are also limitations as well, and the arts ecosystem isn't just these 4 organizations. So I thought you guys could maybe respond to, I guess, what's missing, and also how could others provide support for the arts ecosystem as well in terms of holding and making spaces for the arts in Singapore. Where I think here others, it's quite broad. It could be, you know, how other arts practitioners could contribute to this discussion or this kind of alliance as well. But it could also be what does it what does it mean for an arts audience as well? What does it mean for, I guess, arts students as well? But here I will also say that I guess one form of, I guess, important support would also be a financial support. So I think earlier on, I think Yan Ning also mentioned that on the 1st to 7th of December, it's I guess Giving Week as well. So if you actually believe in these arts organizations, I will encourage our audiences to actually donate generously to them as well, because December is also the season of giving and caring.
Yeah.
All year it can be season of giving. It don't have to be December only.
But maybe December you have year-end bonus. I don't know.
We're looking towards the non-arts people to contribute, right?
But apart from, I guess, financial support, how else could others provide support for the arts? Like what's missing?
I mean, what comes to mind is the word that Jian Hong brought up earlier about advocacy. I think that can never be lack of advocacy across all types of people, right? At any chance possible, we will advocate for what we do or for the arts in general, the kind of value that it brings. And not only just of it as a tool, which is what we are most familiar with, but the intrinsic value of why do we move the way we do, why do we ask difficult questions, but how do we resolve difficult questions in good faith and respect. I think that's the power of the arts. So to urge everyone to always communicate that truly, yeah.
For me, it's how to patch the hole in the wall that Jian Hong was referring to earlier, so that we can stop breaking chopsticks. And I think that also comes down to advocacy, right? How do we, in a sense, speak about our work in a way that resonates with people outside of the arts, so that what we do can be valued in a certain way, and so that the arts stops being a kind of afterthought or luxury, and becomes a kind of necessity. And it's but yeah, so I want to patch the hole in the wall.
Shima?
So many holes, huh? Honestly, I mean, as positive as I usually am, I'm also very aware of that there is a way, there's a sort of dichotomy sometimes when like, oh, so artistic, so deep, then like, think so much, So I feel like it's pretty important then for us, not only just as, also being aware that we're all moving parts of this greater belief of how arts is really a way of life. And it's pretty much simple because the moment that, now that I guess it's in the birthing period, like the voice of your mom, like the soothes your soul. And I think that this is essentially what we need for people to really take care of their mental and physical health. And all we need to do is to sort of really go back to the essence of humanity, go back to really talking about it in a very simple way for people to understand beyond just cerebrally. So yeah, let's do that, and then probably have more soul-searching conversations over food.
At
which,
tuck shop?
Yeah, at the tuck shop, and really be very aware of that there are different personalities that needs to really lead us.
Jian Hong.
I think this in the past 50 some hours now we're coming to end of 55. But we started with a space. We started with going back to the second home, for practice. The first one is like barely a year or so that really didn't register as much, right? But we went through Summerview Walk, and then we went to Stanford Art Center, and then we will come here pretty soon, in the next program. And when I took my mom back to the place where that was my first home, right? I said I was born then in hospital first, then there. All the people that have gone through that space, all the Stanford Art Center, they connect their memories, and they reconnect with the impulse of why they do this in the first, why they did this, right? How they have sustained with physical spaces, right? So the physical spaces is very, very important, but the physical spaces are only meaningful when there are people who go in to do something in there. And through time, it takes time. It takes a lot of time for those molding and for those building and for layers and layers to happen, to give a space souls, right? So I think that, to me, that is the hardest thing, to be patient, but to see this micro increment of layers that we're building, and to negotiate with each other, how do we not wipe off each other's work, So I think we just need to keep talking. There's no other way to do it except to know that it takes more than one party to get this done. And I think for the artists out there, I would like to say that this is meaningless unless you also come and create within, right? And how would you want to use it? You can only ask, right? And what's the worst case scenario? you ain't got it in the first place, and you ain't got it at the end, it's just at the same place. You are not, there's no loss.
So this brings us actually to the end of our conversation because we've run out of time. But I would like to thank everyone, so Jian Hong, Chelsea, Shima, and Yeling for joining me here today for this panel. And I also hope that for the audience out there, whoever you may be, that hopefully this talk has also kind of increased your curiosity in terms of the spaces that these arts organizations hold in Waterloo Street, and for you to visit them and also support the programs and the projects that they are running as well. And of course, as I mentioned, they all have their giving.sg pages as well, so please donate generously to them. And I think here I would like to end quite aptly with a comment, our only comment that we got from our neighbor as well, where I think this also draws the importance, highlights, another way of holding space, which is actually through kind of archives and documentation as well as what Practice is doing here today in terms of your 55-hour live stream. So for everyone that's tuning in, I hope that you continue to tune in further, and I'll pass it back to our co-hosts.